Hello, everyone. I hope you are having a lovely time at the conference in person because I'm not there in person, hence the video. I'm so sorry. I wish I could have been there. But I live in France and our country at the moment is on fire. Everybody is doing strikes. You see riots, things on fire. The garbage is not being picked up. Trams, buses, trains, nothing is going. Even planes are cancelled. So I really tried my best to book my travel to London, but it's like the biggest strikes of since World War II. So it's hard to do. Anyway, so let's act like it's 2021 again. We're going to do a video for a conference talk. So today I want to talk to you about how to sniff out the glue code monster. And yes, I actually said the glue code monster. So let's talk about what that is. But first, my name is Tim Bennix and I'm the Director of Developer Relations at Uniform. And actually at Uniform, we are battling the glue code monster. But how that works and why, we'll get into it. So I work a lot in our community. So I'm an ambassador for things like Nuxt.js, for Algolia, for Supabase. But I also work at the Mac Alliance, where I'm a member of the technical council, where we talk about what is Mac, what is headless, all these things. And so my accent is a little strange. That's because I was born in the Netherlands, but then I live in France and I work with Americans. And so if anything is strange, this is why. So let's get into it. So the modern tech stack is actually pretty awesome, right? But when you start scaling it with all these headless systems and your fancy front ends, it's getting really challenging at scale. And so this is a bit controversial, but I don't think it's going to work when you do really big projects with all the modern tools. So let's talk about that. So essentially, you are the composer of your stack. You're the developer or the architect or the product owner. And so you just grab a collection of the tools that you love, put them together, and then make your channel, website, iPhone app, whatever. But just combining these headless sources doesn't mean you're going to be successful, right? It's not a composable architecture out of the blue. You kind of have to work at it, and generally that's really hard to do. So imagine you tend to start with your CMS, right? Or maybe with your front end, and you kind of connect them up. This is how you start small, but let's imagine now that we're going to do an e-commerce that's going to grow globally over a year. Well, the moment you feel the need for performance and growth, you're going to add a certain types of products. So in this case, we're going to add Cloudinary because images at scale need to be presented fast. You need to be able to crop a face or a product or something, and Cloudinary is amazing for that. And it's also a DAM, so you can store your assets there. So you need to connect everything up. Well, then you might need some search, right? Either for searching a product catalog or whatever, a blog, things like that. So that also needs to be connected because all your Algolia index needs to be filled by a few things. Well, here is your commerce. Let's say Shopify. Well, your Shopify needs to be connected to your front end. You need to be able to go to, let's say, a checkout, a bag, things like that. But it also needs to be connected to your CMS, because how else do you grab information from your shop, put it in a page on your CMS, and then show on your front end? All the images need to go there. Your index needs to be able to grab all your product information so you can search your products in a really nice way. You need analytics. You actually need hosting. And then all these services likely have to be connected to this hosting CI/CD stack provider somehow to, when something changes, trigger a new release or do something, right? And so you're going to see a change here means a rebuild or I don't know, whatever you want to do there. And then, of course, when you grow, you probably need something like HubSpot or CRM-like capabilities because you might want to send emails, campaigns, whatever. That also has to be connected everywhere. And you see how many things are actually now started to connect. And this is relatively basic. Normally, bigger projects have way more than just this because they might have legacy APIs and other things that define their business, right? And then the real thing starts to happen. You grow and you have, let's say you go from Europe to the US, and there they just like a different CMS because something is already built. This is the realistic, scenario. So let's add in a new CMS and let's connect it to everything. You see how crazy this is starting to get? How you are cloning connections and like how are these things connected anyways? Do they have app stores? Do they use serverless functions that change data? It's starting to get a little bit mad, to be fair. And so I dare you, try to switch out one of these services because they don't work or add something else while the thing is running. This is going to be a pretty bad time, and you're going to be this as a developer, right? You change one thing, another thing falls over. How have I integrated this? Oh, I forgot that the dude 2 years ago did this. You're going to be essentially like this guy with this Dyson. This fire is not going to go out. And so essentially you wanted this because you have headless systems. You put code together so it's open, transparent. But after 2 years of like a growing business, you get to this. And this you don't want. And so this is Gludo, the glue code monster. And so essentially, glue code is the thing that connects all these services together. And I mean, we call this glue because it's hard to unstick, right? And so we are able to define if you are using glue code somehow by asking a few questions. So in your mind, think about, or in the chat, just say yes or no if you're dealing with these questions. So first one, do you clean up that messy API response so its data fits your front end? Well, because every API is different, right? And sometimes APIs change, or sometimes a field is just not there. So you need to add some code somewhere to map that data so your components understand it. That is glue code. Or do you just adapt your front-end components to whatever that API gives you? So you add a little bit of cleaning up stuff or lots of like defensive code in your front-end components themselves. That can also work because you might not have like a backend team or an API developer somehow. So you're just adapting locally. And then there's another one. So do you actually mix your domain data with design-related data in your data models in, let's say, your product category? Or in your product CMS or whatever. What I mean by that is this product is now featured. That adds a checkbox to this domain model so it shows big on the front end. Well, over time, when you keep adding checkboxes and dropdowns to data models, they are muddled with design-related things. And then it's really hard to actually still understand what they're doing. And if you remove something, maybe something breaks. And for that, you need a lot of defensive code and a lot of cleaning up and just extra brain power. And we don't want that glue sitting in between everything, that code that you had to make. So if you've said yes to some of these questions, or like partly, even partly, you are probably pretty good at glue code. And it's actually a fun part of coding sometimes. But wouldn't you like to not have to do that and only deal with like the super fun front end or the super fun API creation part of your job, right? And so let's just give you a quick example of what I think about the glue code, of like what it could be. And we're doing it with like the most optimistic example. So essentially, let's say you want a list of videos from YouTube, but you want it from an API call from the playlist because you want it curated a certain way. Well, what you do is you query and map the video IDs that you get back, because there's a lot of other data in that playlist API that you don't need. You just need a list with videos, right? So you have a bit of memory where you have an array with a few IDs. Well, then you need to get the information about these videos. Well, then you just go to the YouTube video API. What you do is you query for each of these IDs, you query the API and you get more information back. But it's kind of a lot that you get back. You don't need it, right? You only need maybe the ID that you already have. You need the title and the image. Maybe that's enough for now. And please correct me if I'm wrong. It could be that the API actually works a bit differently, but this is just an example. So what you'll do, you have a few calls, you clean it up again, and then in the end, you come up with one list of what you use. But YouTube or Google's APIs are really solid, right? Everybody uses them, they're cool. Imagine if this is a less good API. Imagine if it just changes, or if a field suddenly doesn't exist, if it's empty. You're gonna have to do a lot of like defensive like coding, cleaning up things, and if it doesn't exist, you fill it up with mock data, or maybe you don't. That is a lot of messy code just to get this list of videos, right? And what if you have to go to Vimeo suddenly? What do you do with this code? You just toss it away? It kind of feels a bit icky to have this. So, glue code is a highly defensive code which fetches data and cleanses it, right? And so glue code creates technical debt, and it tight couples specific code to specific services. And sometimes that's fine. You need a little bit of glue maybe, but too much glue and you cannot change anything anymore. You cannot adapt, you cannot innovate. And the more tech debt you have, the slower you get, the more upset your developers, the more developers leave, and suddenly there's no longer a team.
Boy, that escalated quickly. Now what?
We need to get rid of the glue code monster, essentially. And so there is a way. And so the way to unglue this whole system or this whole approach with all this crazy code is something we like to call digital experience composition, or we call it DXC, which is yet another acronym we're throwing in your faces here. I'm sorry, it's yet another one, but this is actually something that, to me at least, having worked with these large systems as a developer lead, it changes the game. And even if you're a junior developer or you don't really understand all this yet, this is a thing that's going to help you going forward. So essentially, right now, when you don't have DXC, you're the guy on the left. Or maybe your boss is the guy on the left who sits on the pile of all the cables, knows exactly where they go. But what if this guy is not there? Do you know how to find these cables? How to untangle one thing? It's pretty hard, right? And so what DXC does is actually give you the thing on the right, which is still hard to understand, but it's a lot more organized. And it's more friendly to different disciplines, but we'll talk about that later. So essentially, this is how you would build a page nowadays. Let's say this is your page. There's a hero component with a campaign, and that's connected to a CMS. Well, maybe the image comes from the DAM system. Then you have another little component which is connected through Algolia, because potentially this is just a search result or a personalized thing that's similar to something else showing on the page. And then there's a product where the image comes from the DAM system again, and then the product is selected from Shopify. So you see how many connections are on one page here. What do? You have to kind of connect to them from the front end, and you kind of code all these things together. That's pretty messy. It works, but why if you change one thing? What do? Your content editor is going to be calling you. It's like, hey, dude, can you just change this thing? I want to have like 5 products here. You're like, yeah, but I have to code something. And of course, there is in between solutions, but this happens more than you think. And so the DXC, the digital experience composition layer, sits in between here. So all these systems, they actually connect to the DXC, and then the front end connects to the DXC as well. And that kind of sounds like an API aggregator, but it's actually way more. Because essentially, if you do this right, you get preview of your page independently of whatever is connected to it, right? You get freedom to choose your stack, because if there's one endpoint, you can go to, Next.js, Nuxt. Maybe we go Astro, because why not, right? Island architecture for the win. You get to choose, it doesn't matter. This, of course, is the same thing as if you did it another way. You can always choose what you want. But here, if you wanted to, you can go to SvelteKit in 2 weeks if you have the time to rebuild, but you then actually don't have to care about how it's connected. Anyways, because you have all the sources here, you can actually add something like personalization, for example, without having to worry, how do I do personalization in Shopify, and how do I do it in my CMS, and how do I do it in my search engine? You can actually do that across these systems without a problem. And the beauty is, if you do it right, which I'll show you in a sec, you can actually have a no-code editor on the front-end side of things that is agnostic from how you do all your code. And so content editors will be very happy with you for once, right? And so this is the traditional page. And here sits the DXC around it, which will then essentially just connect to all the services for you, and you can talk to the DXC. And it's a very light SDK, which is very interesting, right? You suddenly have less to worry about. And so this does give us a new way of how we create pages, like the separation of concerns between where data lives and where design lives, where your design-driven system is actually different. So we should talk about that for a sec. And so we have domain data versus design data. And in a DXC system, this is actually separated out much more than you're used to right now, because such a system doesn't really exist. Well, there's some of them, like a backend for front end has part of it, an API aggregator has some of it, a monolith CMS has some of it. But in this case, we separate it out more. So domain data is the data that defines your brand or your customer's data, your customer's brand, like products. They sit in one place in a product inventory system or whatever you want to call it. And you can use those in 10 years, or you can use them next month, and they keep being enriched and made better, but it's very clean data. Your design data, however, sits on your front end, and kind of you want to maybe make something featured. You do that in your front end. You add a checkbox in your data model in your design data. And so an example could be, imagine you have an events website, right? Like CityJS. You guys have a ton of different events in different cities. Well, the event data sits in the CMS, like venues, speakers, addresses, times, whatever. This is all data modeled, really neatly data modeled in your system where that's supposed to happen. But now it's CityJS, right? So last week on the website, you're going to push for CityJS London. That's a featured event. Well, what you would do without a DXC is you go to your data model in your CMS and you add a checkbox for it's a featured event right now. And you maybe add a drop down for make the font a bit bolder and make it a red background because we can. And over time, the more and more this happens, more of these little checkboxes and drop downs come in. And so what happens if you kind of see this event in a different context? If it's in a search result, these checkboxes make no sense, right? So you're dirtying up your domain data. And so when it's bigger and you have a multi-tenant operation, somebody in Malaysia might say, I don't need that checkbox. Let me just remove that because I'm cleaning up my data model because it's hard to edit and understand. Then somewhere in Germany, your website is just dead now because the data is no longer there. This causes you technical debt, glue code, complicated stuff. So what you do is your domain data stays clear and you have another system where you do all your design related stuff. So things like featured event, that's a title that makes no sense in CMS because it has no context. It's just a little string. But when you put it in your design data for that page, in that context, for that week, it makes total sense. So all the checkboxes, all the variants in like how does it look, that's design data that sits in your DXC. And your domain data stays around it. So it's a very clean separation. And so this benefits developers quite a bit. So let's talk about that. So for front-end people, so your components are now completely agnostic. They don't know what it connects to. Your components are design system components, essentially. Your props are your props. This is how it was designed. This is how it's used. You don't have to worry about more than that when you have a DXA. So essentially, you make a front end that is stupid. I know it's kind of silly to say, right? But the more stupid your front end, the less prone to error it is. The less glue code you need to morph things so it fits your component. That all happens in the DXC. You can literally say in a DXC, this is my component that sits in the front end and in my DXC. And these props I need. So you connect the props to an external system in your DXC directly to the fields, and it just goes one-to-one to your front end. Your front end is stupid. Believe me, you want that. And then so when you're full stack, or whoever is full stack, you can kind of, if you want to connect anything to this the same way in any front end or in any framework. And so you can basically, if you wanted to, have the DXC map all these props for you directly. Or if you want a little bit of glue or you need to change something because maybe you have to go deeper into whatever query it is in your CMS and follow some connections, you can actually do that in a really nice way because there's an SDK from this DXC to do that. And so doing things the same way is much easier with unit tests. It's much less brain power. Everything gets better, right? And so if you can choose whatever front end you want, you can host it anywhere. You can render it any mode you want, right? So freedom is cool. And so the agnostic stupid front end is actually pretty awesome. And so this, for example, is my homepage. I recently released this using the DXC from Uniform because Uniform is actually DXC. I can't believe I'm only telling you now, but it is. And so essentially, let's just have a look at how this was built. So we have the DXC, which is Uniform, and it has a slug to a certain composition, which is this page. In this case, the slash because it's home. And so this hero component is basically represented in the front end. This is my Next.js code. It's a hero component with a few props that's represented in the DXC as well as a hero component with a few props. And so this now has a Cloudinary image, but it also has like a title and stuff, and we'll get there in a sec. Well, then I have latest videos, which is also represented in the DXC. And for me, I just connect to YouTube, get the latest videos in the DXC, so the front end doesn't connect to anything. Then my upcoming talks, that component actually talks to Contentful. That's where I add these, but it can also be in Sessionize or any other place, maybe Notion, where you just write down all your talks. This just connects to the DXC. Frontend doesn't know. Then you have your latest writings. And in my case, actually these comes from dev.to because I like to write there. And so when I click on one of those, I just go to the external system where my domain data lives, right? And so we still have these titles, right? Latest videos, upcoming talks, Tim Bennix, blah, blah, blah. These are actually stored in the DXC because they are context-based to this design. Because when I decide not to have upcoming talks there, but do something else, that data shouldn't have to live in some CMS. You just type it in. So in that case, a DXC is almost like a little design data-related micro CMS. But it's not a CMS. It just points to stuff. And so right now, this is hosted on Vercel with Next.js 13. And Uniform's data, I chose, in this case, comes from the CDN edge that Uniform has, which means my dynamic data is cached on the CDN edge close to me. So this is an SSR website. And it's rendering in like 100 milliseconds or less per page, which is pretty epic. And so let's see a bit about how Uniform actually stores that stuff on the edge. So basically what you get is there's a composition with a bunch of components in the DXC. Then that becomes JSON. It's basically just a REST API to get all that information. It can either be a pointer to a thing elsewhere, or it's actually all their props already just stored here. And that actually then, talks to all these systems. And then whatever came out of that is enriched, because this JSON composition is initially is just, I'm pointing to some external services, right? Then it goes to the CDN edge, where it actually is enriched with all the information that you need and cached there. And then it goes to your front end. And the front end has a relatively light SDK to just talk to that enriched CDN edge endpoint. And so there is an extra thing though, because you might want to hook in to whatever comes out of Uniform. For example, it could be that for my Cloudinary image, I only get an ID, but I might actually want to get the alt tag. This is just an example, right? So you get hooks in the Uniform SDK to be able to just get the initial data and then query other systems. And then enrich that and then send it to your front end. So if you wanted to add just a little glue just to do the things that you need as a developer, you can. And so this gives you a bunch of freedom, right? And so my front end component in this case is just a simple one. It doesn't know about anything other than these are my props. This is how I render it. Keeps it very simple. If I wanted to change this in Vue, no problem, just works. And so it's not just a backend for front end, but it's also not really an API aggregator because it does a few things more. So I actually made like a little video of how I edit my website. You can see I'm visually editing this, right? So I'm adding a little list here, right? And I want it to be a grid. So let's just fill out a little title. And so this title represents an atom for front-end component in my front end. You see it directly renders. And here you can add loops. And I've added a data model to find my latest YouTube videos. And that data model is set up in the DXC. Then you just assign whatever comes out of that API, you assign it to your props. And so literally what you see on the right here are the props of my component. And so you can set it to video, add a title. Well, in this case, description is not really needed, I think, but why not? You can add the date, and then there's adding the media, and you see it literally build up over time when I add this stuff. And this way you can add a bunch more things because you can actually add like personalization related stuff, changing things up. So this actually is agnostic to the tech. It just works with this very light SDK. So developers are pretty happy with that, hopefully. But then content editors can visually do this. This is literally my live website being edited in draft mode. When I hit publish, it actually rebuilds or whatever. In this case, nothing happens because it's SSR. It just has to cache on the CDN. And so we went from this to this. It's a lot more exciting and a lot more structured. And it also helps you to, like the thing is, it can be as small as you want because you can essentially just have this old system and slowly start integrating with the new system. And then over time, you just grab a little bit more into the new system and you're good to go. And so this is what I wanted to talk to you about. And so if you're interested in this whole approach and you like what you heard, Uniform is actually one of the only ones to do all this. There's a few other companies touching upon it, like Netlify is going in a certain direction, but only code. You have other systems that touch it, but not fully. And so if you're interested, you can just join our Discord. You can scan the QR code or just go to uniform.to/Discord so we can chat about this, because it is a really exciting way for the future. And so thank you very much. If you like this, feel free to follow me either on Twitter or on YouTube. And thank you for sitting through a video rather than me being in person. And next time I'll be there. Cheers.